Welcome to Creating Value Wins. I'm Steve Denning, and I'm here today with Doug Kirkpatrick, under Hastings, and Hugo Lourenço. We have a great show today, and I'm so happy to have you three with me. So let's make this practical for our listeners. In this podcast, we explore the paradigm shift from obsolete management to a new way of running companies with creating value, particularly for customers, but also employees and for society. And we can summarize this in 3 words: creating value wins. And in one sense, it's a very simple idea, but it's a very deep idea. And we hope as you listen to these podcasts, you'll learn about the deeper implications of what we're talking about. And by value, we mean in this podcast, value for customers principally. Yesterday, we just received the latest Harvard Business Review, and I found an article on page 122. And we learn in this piece that value is not value for customers, value is for shareholders. Basically, firms should be maximizing shareholder value, a mantra that we heard for 50 years, ever since Milton Friedman back in 1970. And the title of the article is Bring Back Managing for Value, which is similar to the title of our podcast, except that they mean the opposite in terms of value. They mean value for shareholders, not value for customers. And for them, a customer is not a person. It's not someone with whom they have an interaction. A customer is a constraint. So this article is turning customers into constraints. And if you think it feels wonderful to be considered a constraint, you're going to love this article. And customers, in their view, not a goal. Customers are merely one of a number of constraints. And the goal of the firm is to make as much money as possible for its shareholders. And striking examples it gives of this are 2 strange examples. One is Costco, which they say is a company which totally focused on maximizing shareholder value, which if you read anything about Costco, you'll find very hard to find that in their thinking. And the other is BP, which they cite as a success story of maximizing shareholder value. But if you check their shareholder value, you'll see that they are in deep trouble. So it's striking that they select those 2 examples of this theory, which I thought was defunct, but apparently, according to Harvard Business Review, the world's leading management channel, they are saying that it is alive and well. And in fact, companies have already turned in this direction. And maybe the fact that the article is at the back of the magazine, page 122, proposing such a radical thesis that something that we thought everyone agreed was defunct is not defunct. The reason why it is at the back of the magazine is that the editors are testing whether maybe there's some life in this old idea and seeing whether there's a positive reaction to it. They're not putting it on the front page, which they would if they actually believed that this was something that would receive strong support. And so we believe that this article is really misconceived, and we'll be talking about it a lot over the coming podcasts, not just this one, but later podcasts, when we are seeing the implications of trying to go back to maximizing shareholder value, which has, in fact, if you think about what happened after the decision of the Business Roundtable in August 2019, when 200 companies, leading companies, and particularly in America, signed a declaration saying maximizing shareholder value was defunct. It was obsolete and needed to be replaced with creating value for the different stakeholders in the organization. In fact, studies by Lucian Bebchuk at Harvard Law School showed that none of the signatories actually made any operational changes to implement the memorandum, and those that had been pursuing maximizing shareholder value continued to do so. And those that had moved on continued to move on. It was simply a public relations exercise. And what we see more recently is that more and more people are realizing that, in fact, maximizing shareholder value is going on in the background, under covers, in the dark of night, in secret boardrooms. That is how 70% of companies are being run. And we've been saying this throughout these podcasts. And now Eric Ries, in his book, Incorruptible, is now saying the same thing, that in fact, maximizing shareholder value is a financial gravity almost, that is an irresistible force that compels company to look into and to regard customers as constraints and pursue maximizing shareholder value. And this idea, which needs to have light shed on it, and so we've been shedding light on it. Eric Ries is shedding light on it, and now in a back to front way, Harvard Business Review is shedding light on it by pretending that in fact the idea never died, and that in fact we need to get back to it and implement it again. And this sort of 20th century idea should once again be the be-all and end-all of management. So, guys, what do you think about this brave new world that we're entering into, where maximizing shareholder value is once again the be-all and end-all of management?
Well, Steve, if I can jump in, that's the essence of the problem, the business school problem. HBR is associated with HBS, the business school. And business schools have been teaching this wrong way around thinking about business for 100 years now. Mark Packard and I called it the administration trap, that you try to bureaucratically, rules-based control the firm so that it maximizes output for owners, shareholders, not for customers, and get the whole thing wrong. And as you say, it's an evil monster that we're finding it's hard to kill. And HBR is obviously trying to revivify something, and we need to keep trying to kill it.
Yeah, what comes to mind for me, Steve, is I look at examples around the landscape, and as a not particularly successful investor in the past in the food and restaurant business, if you look at how those companies treat their customers, the companies that prioritize customer satisfaction actually perform far better than companies that try to allocate attention to various stakeholder groups. So we look at companies like Chili's and Jersey Mike's, who are prioritizing customers and performing at high levels for investors and all stakeholders, including suppliers. And other companies that have been taken over by private equity and trying to make everybody happy and especially deliver shareholder returns are really floundering in the marketplace. And so the evidence that we see just looking around, scanning the landscape, suggests that this idea of balancing stakeholder interests in the pursuit of profits and shareholder returns is just not that effective.
What concerns me more is this vocabulary, what will lead certain behaviors and leadership behaviors as well. And I think coming back to that same old school, and I think at a certain point, perhaps Eric Ries is right. This never had gone, never had go away. It was always there. People just put a facade and trying to be nice and fashion and modern and using the same words, but in fact that's not exactly what they mean, right? What they say they are and what they do, it's quite the opposite or very different from each other to say. And I think that's really concerns to me, that those behaviors and those words will bring to the old behaviors that we have seen in the past. And essentially is, I think, from the brilliant book from Scott Shigeoka, where how curiosity can transform your life and change the world. I think one of the things is how that purpose will bring that diverse curiosity, epistemic curiosity, or empathic curiosity, or even social curiosity for the people that works for a company like that. I have concerns, really concerns. And perhaps this is one of the reasons why a lot of things have faded away, because we haven't seen that change to be embraced with the right purpose, which means people that really care.
Thanks, guys. And we'll be coming back to this issue again and again, because it's right at the heart of our discussion. And today we are going to look at the question, why do some people and some organizations create enormous value, while others don't? And we're going to look not just at the situation today, but looking back through history and see what is it that has enabled people and organizations to achieve a great deal, and what has stood in the way of the others. And of course, there's a whole hundreds of libraries giving all of the that's been written on this subject. But we're going to focus on a few key ideas. One, which we talked about in an earlier one, is the idea of Pope Leo with his new encyclical, which said essentially that people should love God and they should treat every human being with dignity, and particularly workers should be treated with special dignity to make sure that they are not misused. He did not mention the customer once in the entire 40,000 words of the encyclical. It's simply not on his radar. So he's, in a sense, living in a very different world. We've just had this Harvard Business Review article suggesting its lens on how you create value, you maximize profits, and treat customers as constraints. The lens that we've offered in this podcast is radically different, and it's about creating value for customers. And in one sense, this is newly prominent, but it is a very, very old idea. And if we look back through history, customers have been central for businesses throughout the ages. And firms that focus on creating value and deliver on creating value for customers make much more money than doing what the HBR article suggests, focusing on by creating value for shareholders. And we actually saw in episode 2 a vivid picture of the data summarizing this, which shows what happens to the firms on the left, which are stuck in below average returns, whereas firms that are creating value for customers are racing ahead with much, much higher returns on the right of the graph. So we are offering data and documents to support the theory of what we're putting here, whereas the Harvard Business Review article doesn't have any data. It gives a few examples, very strange couple of examples to make its thesis, but there is no basis for except there's a feeling in them that this is the way we used to go and maybe we should get back to it. In particular, what we're suggesting is that as we look over the human population over the last 100,000 years, we can take a lens in which we see it in terms of 5 different groups. And our hope is that by looking at these different groups of people and seeing how it's played out over time, what the meaning of these groups really are. And the 5 lenses of individuals and organizations sort out humanity and begin with what we call saints. Hunter, would you like to tell us what we mean by a saint?
Saint is someone or some institution that is sacrificing itself with perhaps the idealistic target of helping others. They usually end up in a bad way. I'm thinking of Saint Sebastian, who ended up with a riddle of arrows, not in his back, but in his front. So, saints have a bad ending. And if we try to put a business spin on that, it's the era of maybe attempting to create value of some kind, but forgetting the feedback loop from the customer who provides approval. The approval comes in the way of profits, because that's the customer sending the signal that I'm getting value and I'm approving of the way that you invest resources, and I will give you a profit so you can reinvest in continuous improvement. The saint forgets that half and is totally self-sacrificing and quickly goes out of business with the arrows in the front. So that's how I see saints. It's an error category in our group.
Well, I'm curious, Hunter, if the saint category is suggestive of radical self-management, where purpose seems to be paramount and perhaps unsustainable unless you focus on some self-care and self-preservation.
Yep, a better analogy than mine.
It often seems as though the purpose is sort of tacked on top, and you have a company that's being run in a normal way, and then you say, oh, but we have this higher purpose. We're going to populate Mars or do something incredible, and therefore you should buy my automobiles, with the purpose not having anything to do with what the company is currently doing. But let's turn to a second category, which is value creators. Hunter, would you like to tell us what we mean by value creators?
Well, value creation should be the purpose of all companies. So we define it as creating value for customers, pursuing new economic value for those customers, and then taking the feedback from those customers who evaluate and communicate that value is being indeed created, and you get a positive cycle from that. So value creation is the pursuit, because you can't always be certain of the future value that you're creating. So you pursue it. If you get the feedback that you made an error in your experimentation, then you respond with better value creation. So you go from saint to value creator by being in the feedback loop where the customer is the recipient of the value creation efforts. That's the center of our distribution, the value creator.
And we have shown in earlier podcasts the data supporting the great returns that you get when you do value creation in the right way. But there's the opposite category, the self-dealers, the people, organizations which are in it for themselves. Not that they ignore, but they prioritize value for themselves ahead of others. Doug, could you tell us a little bit about this important category of people and organizations?
Yeah, Steve. Well, it's important because it's the majority. So, self-dealers represent about 60% of all public firms, and they seem to prioritize their own interests and making money in order to serve others, so they claim, but they just continue on that path of self-dealing, and they are the majority. They represent classic human factors failure. So Lucian Bebchuk's analysis of the 2019 Business Roundtable showed mostly signaling. Jack Welch's GE era and early Ballmer Microsoft would fit in that category. And now HBR is bringing the self-dealers out of the closet, putting them back in charge of the firm, as they have been for the last 50, 60, 70 years, although somewhat hidden in the shadows since 2019. And now they would be explicitly back helming the ship, and stakeholders like customers would be viewed as just another category of stakeholders, constraints needing to be overcome in the pursuit of profit.
I think I find these categories useful as orientation rather than fixed identities. So from a human factors perspective, I believe behavior is shaped by goals, incentives, information, authority, pressure. A company may genuinely speak about serving customers and employees while its operating system repeatedly rewards short-term extraction. So I would be careful about asking whether someone is value creator or self-dealer, Because a more practical question could be, what behavior does the system make easier, safer, and more rewarding? Because sometimes the system is almost set up for us to fail. And we might be rewarding things in short term that people will not be blamed on long term because they will not be there anymore. And in long term, they are killing everything that the company might be trying to achieve, which is basically create a customer or keep a customer. So with value extractors, I look less at they claim to create and more at where the cost and consequences will end up. An organization may generate revenue or shareholder returns while transferring risk, harm, or complexity, or long-term cost to the employees, customers, suppliers, or to the society. And I've seen that a lot of time. No one in procurement will be accused about the choices because they got the bonus for that 15% reduction. And in the meantime, the customer is full of pain, and some workers are full of pain because of that decision, and they brought the wrong people or the wrong tools or the wrong things, and nobody's there. So I think this is very concerned to me about this topic, which is very, very important, as you mentioned before.
There are also obviously people who go through life, go through a work experience, go through their personal life, not ever coming to a closure as to why they exist, what is their purpose in life, do they consider creating value for themselves or for others, and often just follow the context. So if they are in a self-dealing organization, they start to act like self-dealers. If they're in a value creation organization, they start to act like value creation. They are what we are calling oscillators. They're floating. Floaters might be a better term than oscillators. We're still looking at that term.
That's one of the reasons why make extraction difficult to see. The organization might look successful from the inside, its own metrics, and everything is green and beautiful, but we don't know if it's because of somebody else is carrying the real cost of all this. So the useful question is, are we creating new value, or we are capturing value while externalizing the consequences?
That is obviously a central topic in the U.S. political environment today, and we won't get into it right now, but it is a central question. People say one thing, but are doing the exact opposite.
Because we see self-dealing patterns when the public narrative and the operating reality begin to separate, right? An organization might talk about customers, employees, or responsible technology, while their investment decisions or executive incentives or even their performance measures continue to reward cost reduction, control, short-term financial results, and all of them because of that language that tells that the organization would like to believe, but where it puts the money, attention, authority, and that consequences tells us what actually their values are. And they are quite the opposite. And that dissonance, we need to push back. It's time to push back on those people that become a little bit hypocrite by trying to tell us things into our eyes, but basically they are doing right the opposite, and they are killing all that.
Just to bring this to greater clarity to these 5 categories, I'd like to ask you to suggest a few current examples. Pick a category and suggest a few current examples of firms that you think epitomize this category.
Well, Steve, for Saints, I might think of certain B Corps or founders that sacrifice scale in pursuit of a mission. Perhaps social enterprises, healthcare companies, for example.
Well, I think we have a category in the U.S. we call 501c3, which is it's called a nonprofit corporation, and often well-intentioned, often extremely temporary. So they're probably trying to be saints, and by calling themselves nonprofit, they fall into that era. For value creators, you mentioned Costco, and I'll describe the Costco model later on. But they're a great example of what HBR gets absolutely wrong, and that the operators of Costco get absolutely right. So I'll nominate them.
So self-dealers like legacy banks with ESG talk, but heavy buybacks. Tech firms masking surveillance as a good connection. So value extractors, predatory crypto schemes for AI used purely for mass layoffs without augmentation, basically.
For oscillators, I'd consider Meta, which swung between innovation and ad pressure, and many post-IPO firms are in that vortex as well.
And so these are modern examples, but we're now going to turn to some older examples. And we are going to draw on a famous book by David Graeber, The Dawn of Everything, where he surveyed 100,000 years of human history and looked at exactly the kind of questions that we are now looking at. And so I wanted to start with asking Doug, how does this book relate to what we're talking about here?
Well, it relates quite well, Steve. It challenges most conventional assumptions. For most of humanity's history, people demonstrated extraordinary social flexibility and political imagination, constant experiments with different ways of organizing themselves instead of following some inevitable path toward hierarchy or domination. In Graeber and Wengrow's accounts, saints are seen in the many egalitarian arrangements where people consciously prioritize mutual care, autonomy, and shared flourishing and growth. Seasonal band societies that rejected permanent chiefs, or communities that built monumental architecture through voluntary cooperation without coercion. These structures were often fragile, but they were deliberately chosen. So value creators appear in the diverse, thriving societies that balanced individual freedom with collective benefits. Large decentralized polities, indigenous groups with sophisticated democratic practices, or forager-farmer hybrids that sustained biodiversity and human dignity for millennia. They showed conclusively that complex populous societies didn't automatically require domination. So, Hugo, I'm curious if you could tell us about value creation in the time of Jesus.
It's interesting. So I would say Jesus was the ultimate saint radical, care for the poor and human dignity at the cost of his own life. So the teaching associated with Jesus placed care, dignity, service, and responsibility towards others above status and domination. I think through this lens, he offers a directly challenge to the systems in which authority exists, mainly to protect itself or extract from others. But there is also an organizational lesson here. Even institutions founded around service can drift towards self-protection. Purpose alone does not prevent extraction. Governance, accountability, and everyday behavior still matter.
Powerful foundation. Doug, could you race forward 1,500 years to the Middle Ages? What was going on then?
Yeah, so let's go to the Middle Ages. Feudal lords dominated as extractors. They were extracting rents from serfs with very little reciprocity. Church and monasteries often served as saints or value creators through charity and knowledge preservation. Guilds mixed value creation with quality standards using self-dealing cartels, and merchants were classic oscillators navigating volatile trade relationships. So hierarchical society limited broad value creation and mobility.
Many of the factors we see today were in those situations. But turning now to modern times, when I'm talking here about the last 250 years, which is a period of unprecedented economic growth. It's often forgotten that in this period we're talking about the previous 100,000 years, economic growth was actually minimal. It's staggering to look at those graphs where the previous 100,000 years are basically stuck in a straight line at the bottom, And then in this last 250 years, it started to shoot up in a massive way. And so maybe, Hunter, you could describe that this didn't happen in a smooth flow, that in fact there were phases where there were rapid growth, explosive growth, and then setbacks. And so there were wins and then losses. Could you sort of describe this remarkable history that is in front of us?
Yeah, so that graph you described where there's no increase in per capita income for people in the world until roughly 1800, or you can argue plus or minus a few years beyond that, and then it escalates upwards in a vertical curve. You and I put it in our book, Aberrant Capitalism, Steve. So maybe we can show that graph on the screen. But there are cycles within that exponential upward curve. So Carlota Perez wrote a lot about this in Technological Revolutions and Financial Capital. So she starts, I think, in the Canal Age. So the Canal Age is a perfect example of a great innovation. It transformed trade. It increased the ability for economic growth to be distributed. It takes a lot of investment to dig a canal, to build the lock. And that's the classic entrepreneurial J curve. You get into a deficit situation because the cost of investing capital is high before there's revenue, but then you break out and the benefit that you're creating results in revenue and economic growth. The cycle is that the second half is when other people pile in. They see the profitability of the canals. You get too many people making malinvestments, too much at too late a period of time, and then there tends to be a bust. And that happened in the Canal Age. There was hot money in the system, and you had that cycle. So if you move on from there to railways, you get the same thing. A brilliant, brilliant innovation in transportation. Speaking from a U.S. standpoint, it united the whole country from east to west and north to south, created enormous economic prosperity. There are great winners in the beginning of that, and then too many people entered at the end. But then it sorts itself out, and you get a profitable, beneficial rail system. So you can see that in the car industry, and Henry Ford's innovation of an affordable car that was reliable for people who had to deal with horses and carts before that. Again, it brought into being lots of additional innovation, roads and tires and gas stations and all of those kinds of things. There were many, many, many car companies, and there aren't many left today because too many people pile in after that. But that's a optimizing process. It gets the market to the size it needs to be. So if you think, as you said, of the digital era, we got into the age of the internet and computers. There was the famous 2000 bust where there were too many .com companies coming into the internet era, and it got overinvested, but it sorted itself out quickly. And Carlota calls these golden ages. When you get this right, when you get to the point where everybody is raised up by this new investment, new innovation, new value into the world, creating new opportunities, a bigger possibility space, even though it's short-term cyclical, it's long-term growth. And then just to finish this this element, it's that long-term perspective which is the key to the value creators. This idea of maximizing shareholder value, it hinges on quarterly earnings and monthly revenues and multiplications of that. And the true value creators are thinking long-term. They're thinking 25 years, 50 years, and indeed forever. So that's a brief survey of history. The principle of it is that we're delivering ongoing growth and it won't stop.
But you see, Hunter, there is a recurring human factors pattern here. During periods of rapid growth, local decisions can appear rational while wider systems become increasingly fragile. Each actor follows the incentive in front of them, right? But the combined effect is overconfidence, hidden dependencies, and systemic risk. This is why blaming individual greedy is rarely enough, but we also need to understand the conditions that made the risk or extractive behavior normal, acceptable, and profitable, because that's what we need to understand so we can stop it. Those kind of leadership behaviors that we haven't stopped over years.
We're obviously seeing in the current era that there are some firms which are making absolutely extraordinary sums of money, and it is frequently said they must be robber barons. And the phrase is thrown around, and often with a good deal lack of knowledge about who the robber barons, as they are called by some, and why they were called robber barons, and whether that label was justified, because it relates to how we look at these entrepreneurs who have created enormous value and have become extraordinarily wealthy. Are they robber barons?
Well, let me dive into the history again there, Steve, because it makes me angry to talk about robber barons. So this was about John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil, and he is portrayed as a villain, as you say, as a robber baron. Now, if you think about what John D. Rockefeller did in value creation, he created light for people who didn't have it. So he took down the price of kerosene through scale and efficiency and distribution from, let's say, roughly $1 a gallon to under 3 cents a gallon. And why is that significant? Because people living in the America of the time, out in the rural areas, especially where they'd migrated in the Great Migration, they didn't have light after the sun went down. They couldn't have their kids reading. They couldn't work their sewing machines, the small device that increased productivity in a lot of those homes. They couldn't work in the barn. They couldn't afford candles. Candles were for the rich. And Rockefeller brought light to homes so that they could thrive and produce and have greater family time. So all of that is value creation. So they're not robber barons. They are super effective operators that the market rewards with high margins. So let's put paid to the term robber baron. I hate it.
In our podcast, we always have a segment, the world's dumbest management idea, and this is a huge array of things to choose from. And my suggestion, based on the discussion we've had today, and maybe you have a better idea, that the rediscovery of maximizing shareholder value in the Harvard Business Review of June, July, August 2026 ranks as currently the dumbest idea that I have come across for a very long time. Any improvement on that?
Well, I'll go for a subset of it, Steve, which is the quarterly earnings report. So that kind of maximizing shareholder value revolves around multiplying earnings. They report them quarterly. That's a requirement given to these firms now. It establishes short-termism. It establishes extraction. And Sergey Brin and Larry Page famously refused to give quarterly reports, but most other companies in the public arena do. So I'm nominating quarterly earnings reports.
Any other submissions?
Well, I think one of the world's dumbest management ideas is expecting people to put customer value first while rewarding them for doing the opposite. Value statements cannot compensate for targets or incentives or workloads and authority structures that constantly reward for extraction. And I think that was a beautiful episode today with these lenses that we can explain that sometimes companies are a little bit of everything. We will see. Could be the dumbest idea. Or not.
So that's our show for today. And thanks very much for being with us. You'll see that this is a show that builds on data and actual reality, not on figments of consultants' imagination and business school obsolete thinking. And we'll be dealing with every week more and more of the bad ideas which need to be removed, as well as great ideas that need to be encouraged. And then in our next session, in fact, we'll be having a couple who've written a wonderful book about some very good ideas, the Octopus Organization, and so that will be the subject of our next session. We will also be continuing week by week, and you can, in the meantime, look at the previous episodes, the 8 previous podcasts that we've had, and also shorts, and learn from them. We'll also be taking questions from you and responding to questions as you have them. And so we look forward to seeing you in our future podcasts and being with you and learning how we can together create value and win. Thanks very much.